Do you want to learn more on how to put money to work in regenerative food and agriculture? Follow our video course via investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/course or in the links below. Now, on to the podcast. Provenance is absolutely key and time kills food. Plus, soil amendments are the off-ramps from extractive agriculture and why we need to be able to go long on investments. And we talk a lot about carbon, but water is actually everything. And why we don't focus enough on regenerative agriculture. This and so much more we cover in this interview with the co-founder of Trailhead Capital Tripp. So get a cup of tea. It's over an hour, but I think very enjoyable. And so enjoy. Welcome to another episode of Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, investing as if the planet mattered, a podcast show where I talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land, grow our food and what we eat. And it's time that we, as investors, big and small, and consumers, start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. In March last year, we launched our membership community to make it easy for fans to support our work. And so many of you have joined as a member. We've launched different types of benefits, exclusive content, Q&A webinars with former guests, Ask Me Anything sessions, plus so much more to come in the future. For more information on the different tiers, benefits and how to become a member, check gumroad.com/investingregenag or find the link below. Thank you. Welcome to another interview, today with the co-founder of Trailhead Capital, Tripp Wall. Welcome, Tripp.
Hi, Koen. Really a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
To start with a personal question, which I always love to ask, how did you end up building soil, regenerating soil, focusing your professional and probably also your private time pretty much on regeneration?
Yeah, it's been a circuitous journey, but I really...
What does circuitous mean? I think a long wandering one, but I don't know the word.
A long wandering journey with lots of tangents. And so I come from a timber and cattle lineage and a host of entrepreneurs. And so I've really always...
Then it makes a lot of sense what you're doing.
It all came back, but it's, like I said, hopefully it'll be coherent by the end. But so I've always loved being outside, outdoors, and had a real place in my heart for animals and just really wanted that to be a part of my world. So I've always been involved in clubs and nonprofits that were in and around that. And I, for the last 15 years, have been chairman and president of the Colorado Wildlife Foundation. And then I am on the governor's Western States Water Conservation Partnership. So I have long tried to, make a difference in flora, fauna, and the way that they interacted from a philanthropic perspective, and really decided that wasn't catalytic enough. And so in my professional life, I was at a large asset manager called Alliance Bernstein, where I worked on alternative assets, private wealth, and ESG. And I really wanted to be able to bring those financial chops, if you will, of investing in and across private and public platforms to bear in what I saw was a really sort of glacial and slow path to regeneration through the nonprofits. I still champion that work and am still involved deeply in water, really as a focus, and animals. But I really wanted to bring my capital capabilities into a space where I thought it needed additional resources. And so that was really the genesis of Trailhead, was pulling that together and seeing a piece of the spectrum where entrepreneurs and science were really at the vanguard. And, we wanted to be catalytic and be able to put capital with those innovations, with those ideas, and steward them to build this asset class. And so, really that's with my partners, Mark Lewis and Bobby Pells and Pete Oberle, what we've endeavored to do.
Do you remember if there was a specific point or when you were bitten by the regeneration bug, or because some people can point at a very specific, movie they saw or book they read, or just because they grew up on a farm and they saw what was possible, or was it a slow process in your case? Was it a meeting, a coffee with somebody? What was the trigger when you couldn't let go anymore of? Because you could have focused on sustainable ag and food, you could have focused on renewable energy, you could have focused on mobility. I mean, there are a lot of catalytic places where you could have spent your time and your knowledge in terms of the financial world, but you decided to focus it on a very specific part of the food sector.
So I think I'll go back a little bit to what was a philosophy degree at CU. And I did my graduate work also in axiology and phenomenology. And so I really, like my partners, began reading and really being influenced by, the Herman Daly's, the David Montgomerys, the Paul Greenbergs, and then the Rudolf Steiners for me. So as a philosophy major, I really sort of, delved deep into Steinerian philosophy, anthroposophic medicine, certainly biodynamics, and then, the pedagogical format that he put together called Waldorf schools, which all my children went to. And so really began to be ingratiated in thinking about how, I wanted to really sort of deconstruct the industrial food complex as we knew it. And so actually my straight path there, Koen, was that when I left AllianceBernstein, I bought an independent grocery chain, organic grocery chain that was one of the first movers in the space in the early 70s. And because of the Whole Foods IPO, they had to divest some of their brands. And we bought this brand and reopened it. And so I really started there by trying to procure locally, know all of my suppliers. I really was getting out of trying to have an intermediary like a UNFI or a Cisco. I wanted to have a community and a tapestry that was with our local water, with our local producers, with our local ranchers. And so we opened up the back of the store and let anybody who had the provenance and was doing the right things and their organic papers, or if we knew what they were doing, we would go to their farm. And if they were doing biodynamic practices but not certified, we put it on the shelf. And so that was really my first foray into understanding how we needed to have a supply chain deconstruction, and really where the value and the margin expansion of being able to take out those middlemen could be incredibly accretive to two groups. One were the stewards of the land who, and I told you from my history, I had seen, take 50 cents out of every dollar to be able to have a living wage to do this work on the land in the 1950s to what is, under 10 cents today, and a very hard slogged business of which no second and third generation wants to be a part of. And so, for me, we really want to champion those folks, men and women who stay on the land and steward the land in the right methodologies. And so let's let there be a living wage and premiums on that side, cost reductions and new income streams. On the other side, let's let nutrient dense, fresh, local food be accessible for everybody, right? Not just the affluent or the 1%. And I think for me, the sort of epiphany of regeneration was thinking about that circularity and thinking about how the interconnectivity of our food supply, of our planetary and human health, really all focused right around this medium called soil. And so for me, that became incredibly profound. And we started looking at how can we create vertical farms, regenerative farms that we could then supply the grocery chains so that we could be using our biophotonic principles of sun and soil to create biodiverse local supply chain, that really started to solve for the human maladies and the environmental maladies that we know persist. So that was sort of this part of the circle.
Just to unpack that piece a bit, I'm super curious, why did you choose to buy a food chain after you left that company? Because you could have gone into any other direction. And yes, you care deeply about the water and deeply about the animals, but that not necessarily leads always to buying a food chain out of Whole Foods. Like, what was that trigger into that focus on food and ag instead of land, which could have been, you could set up an NGO, you could join an NGO, you could have, set up a national park, do a lot of other things to protect water and animals. What led you into that very active role of matching demand and supply through the back end of a supermarket and the front end and the shelves?
No, it's a great connecting question because I had a baseline of naturalist, sort of environmentalist.
Yeah, or you could have gone into education with Waldorf and rolled that out over the US. And there was a lot of work to do in that intro you mentioned.
So what it was, and my entry point is very similar to some other people's. I was an athlete. And so I cared deeply. I was a cyclist, still am, and a skier, and cared deeply about my performance. And that then coincided with the birth of my children. And those two things were really pretty instrumental in the way I decided to think about the food system and what I was putting in my body. And once I started thinking about that, I couldn't stop thinking about the full provenance and where it came from. And so that path is fairly circular. And so that's why I said where I can actually make a difference is in the consumer demand side, and by offering products and helping educate the consumer through the food about, what they're doing to the land and what they're doing to the stewards of the land. And really for me, it's about the ethics and the axiology of your dollars, your spending and your investment, which we can talk about a little bit later.
And so how is that chain? Is it still around? I haven't looked up I should have done my homework on this. How has that process been since, when was the IPO of Whole Foods actually? When did you buy that asset, and how long have you been involved in that before or even still when you were setting up Trailhead?
Yes. So sadly, went the way of the dodo during the COVID crisis. I had left as CEO previously, and so sort of the next management team wound it down. But it was an amazing journey that I was involved in, because this was a brand that was actually in Boulder and that I grew up eating from. My parents took me in Denver and Boulder in the late 70s and 80s to these stores, and it was a very unique experience. And so it was super differentiated from anything else. And that's really what I wanted to try to bring back, because everything had been so processed, packaged, and just truncated from a diversity standpoint. It's a theme you're going to hear everywhere, but I wanted to give consumers more choice with good stuff and allow them to understand the nutrient density and then the provenance of where this stuff came from.
And unfortunately, COVID, even with slightly bigger margins and with more space, even though supermarkets the sales went through the roof, right? People started lining up, etc. What triggered then? Simply they just didn't make it?
Well, it was a couple things. So we were really based in a college town. And so CU is a huge demographic base for us. And obviously all of the schools went dark. So that was very difficult for us. And then we really didn't have sort of the omni-channel strategy that I was trying to build. We just hadn't gotten there yet. So we weren't able to, to deliver and meet people where they were. And we had been running on procuring regenerative and beyond organic products sort of exclusively. And so our margins and our volumes were very different than the Krogers of the world that, just do large numbers. And so it was a hard place to be. I still hold out that there is a lot of great retail like Erewhon that is out there making a real difference in differentiating that food supply, because I think the consumers, are starting to demand it with their education.
So let's switch gears a bit to Trailhead. We obviously, we'll link it in the description below, interviewed Mark Lewis, your co-founder, or one of your co-founders. How would you describe, for anybody that didn't listen to that interview, how would you describe Trailhead and your role specifically?
Yeah. So, Trailhead is a venture capital firm that is really trying to break the mold of venture capital by being a B Corp, by impact reporting, both socially and environmentally, and by changing the horizon of patient capital with which we can wrap our entrepreneurs with a continuum that's on their time frame, not an artificial market time frame. So those are three pretty different pillars in VC. And so we really started Trailhead to be in a place in the early spectrum where the ideas and the innovations, the institutions and academia are on the forefront of science, of supply chain, of waste reduction, of transparency and traceability. And there's just no institutional capital really from a large asset class perspective moving into those regenerative companies. And so we really want to build that path and that architecture to make this an institutionally investable class.
And when you talk about that third pillar of time, does that mean you run on a different schedule, like not the 10+2 or the 10+1 in terms of VC funds? Because that's often one of the critiques is they have a few years to invest then they don't do anything for a while. And of course, they add a lot of value to companies. And then they need to divest quite forcefully at some point, usually not at the time that makes sense for the company. Or, I mean, you need a lot of luck for an exit that makes sense both for the company and the VC fund, which creates a lot of tension. So have you figured out a way to get around that time horizon, which comes back and back again in the podcast as being too short or not enough? Although we might have 10 years to fix a lot of these things, which is a counter argument, like let's get going as soon as possible. What has happened there in terms in Trailhead Capital? I mean, for sure, you had a lot of discussions on that.
Well, and we're very attuned to the natural cycles, which aren't artificially in decade blocks. And so I think, what we've built is, yes, our LPs understand that we have extension capabilities to the fund. So it is a typical 10-year life cycle to the fund, but we've built in extensions and then the ability to roll into what will be fund 2. So that we're not forced into making those decisions. The interesting thing I will tell you about this particular time and place, Koen, is that we're actually fighting the opposite. We actually have an offer in a portfolio company that we've been invested in for less than a year that's on the table that we're a little bit hesitant to. We're not the majority party, but it's a little quick for us. We really would like to mentor and steward and be more active in bringing value to that ecosystem. And it looks like because of sort of the froth, because of the transaction, velocity in the space, all of a sudden we may have to exit. And that's a positive thing for the LPs and as a fiduciary, but we don't just think about financial returns.
Yeah, that's an interesting issue and a luxury problem, obviously, to have. And I think we're going to have exactly the same discussion with a few investors and a few funds over the last weeks. Like, yes, we need to innovate on the time horizon, and maybe it might be a holding company, it might be an evergreen fund, etc. Many investors might not be ready for that. I don't know what's your experience there. You might raise a lot less with a lot more trouble. And at the same time, which might be a good battle to have, like spend 2-3 years on the road teaching everybody about evergreen capital and raising 15 million or 10 million and put that to work, or raise significantly more now and spend the next 10 years or next few years investing, which is what we need to kickstart a lot of these companies, and then figure out after, okay, what does the second fund look like and how does that continuum will grow? But it's also a bit like planting a lot of trees in an agroforestry system and hoping that somebody will figure out and like a harvesting machine along the way as they are growing. So it's a bit of a risky bet, but at the same time, I really understand the approach because you cannot innovate on too many things at the same time especially for hesitant investors to get on board.
Well, and I think you've heard my partner, Mark, talk about, the way that we would like to innovate in the structure, again, to be founder friendly. I mean, we really want to be able to wrap the entrepreneurial verve and support that all the way through the continuum. And that doesn't just mean, our investable piece at that time. It means supporting them with the ecosystem and all of our network. And so I think we will continue to, we're building a set of thematic funds. And, we see this as our life's work going forward. But we will, I think, begin to iterate on the format and the structure, to your point, as we get to a point where we have the architecture to fill out. I think first we need to get money in the space into the ideas and grow these seeds into A's and B's and C's to where we have an ecosystem. And then we can get creative. Once we have the institutions involved in the space, we can start to think about what those structures look like.
And to your point, because playing the devil's advocate here, everybody says they're founder friendly. How does that show in this case with you? And specifically, as you mentioned, the space is getting crowdier and hotter in certain places. And you might need to compete with other funds that are not specifically focused on regen, but are starting to get interested, for instance. So how do you make sure you get a seat at the table, not only in the round, but then probably one of the things you can bring is not only the money, but that founder friendliness, the ecosystem, etc. What is your edge there than more than just money? Because it's getting hotter in the space. And
it is getting hotter.
Which is great, but also challenging for groups like yourself.
Well, and I think we feel actually incredibly collaborative. I mean, coming from the asset management world, there's a lot of sharp elbows. And this is really a sort of rising tide lifts all boats. So we love collaborating with all of the sort of luminaries that are out there.
And a lowering tide shows that who's been swimming naked, right? That's the buffet quote.
And to your point, I would say, we think we do have some differentiated edge in sort of our deep regenerative knowledge and, we've been students of this movement for a very long time on the front end, and we've been investing in and thinking about it. And so we have pretty deep networks. So one of the things that we bring is the ability to bring our network, and we can articulate that in terms of customers. So, you've heard about one of our investments called Telesense. It's a hardware orb, predictive analytics for perishability, and it reduces waste, about 30% in barges and grain silos. It also reduces workers' comp because there's an HSE component. You don't have humans having to take core samples, which they get hurt frequently. But when we went into that deal, we were able to bring their 3 top customers now into that equation and, receive a step up in the next round. And so, there's a very articulatable way of how we bring value from our network.
Beyond the cash. Yeah.
Beyond the cash, I would say also we're all founders. So, Mark Lewis has founded and run. Pete has founded and run. I have founded and run, and we've all exited. And so, we've been operators and entrepreneurs as well as investors. And so I think we have a unique lens. I would really implore people to talk to our portfolio CEOs like a Megan Rowe at Whiteleaf to say, this is what Trailhead has been able to do for us, because I don't like patting ourselves on the back, but I do think we have an arsenal of tools to really be supportive. And we try to be active in a really positive way. And sometimes we'll have an entrepreneur tell us, hang on, we're just not there yet. Right? As we try to push for growth and new ideas. And so we try to be really collaborative. And, I have my CEOs that they have my cell phone number. They'll call me on a weekend and I'll take the call and, we'll talk something out.
And that's still possible, obviously, as you're relatively small in a good way. I mean, that might change. And if you have 50 companies with all your cell phone number, it becomes a bit more tricky. But for the time being, that's a non-scalable thing to do, which makes a lot of sense. So what has happened since we talked with Mark in June? What has happened over the summer? The Whiteleaf deal you just mentioned, which we, by the way, also in interview just happened. I think at that time it was just announced. So how has been the summer and what has kept you busy? We're now talking in October, by the way, just for people keeping track. Yeah.
It's been a great summer. It's been incredibly frenetic. Again, it's been unique for us in the sense that we've made now 7 investments. We have about 5 more we're close to that are in the sort of investment committee track. So I think we'll end the year somewhere around 12 to 15 investments, which is a really good clip. We sort of set out to do a deal, a partner per quarter. It was a pace we thought we could, maintain with the sort of rigor of our underwriting and due diligence that we want to have as fiduciaries. So we've made some incredible commitments. We're looking in new and exciting areas that really add on to the portfolio construction and the thematic that we've talked about in and around soil and our sort of 3 verticals, which we can talk about a little bit. But certainly, beyond organic CPG continues to be in our wheelhouse. So Whiteleaf is a great example.
CPG, just for anybody, what does it stand for?
Consumer packaged goods. Forgive me. And so we think of Whiteleaf as it's a biodynamic, Demeter certified. Megan and team just won a Nexty Award at Expo East as they've launched some new SKUs, and those new SKUs are outside of just baby food. So it really is a true provisions brand. And that's really exciting because it really kicks into a deeper soil thesis, which I'd like to go back to. And it really talks about the heavy metal contaminants, the nanoparticulate plastic matter, obviously all of the agrochemical stuff. It's not in Whiteleaf. It's in every other baby food because we in the US don't test our food for heavy metals. So we'll get back to that, but that's a big theme for us in soil and for education in the consumer packaged goods. So you'll see some beyond organic regenerative CPG in our future. We're excited about that.
And do you see there the consumer demand being there that often talked about? People are starting to choose different things in the supermarket. We had a discussion with Nestle over that, I think just before the summer. They started to be very interested in the space because they see people switch, or at least they see that they see people checking ingredients, etc. Do you see that as well? Do you see this finally, the consumer getting out of that few percent that really go to that organic shop and really read the labels? Like, does it get to that, I don't know, early adopters, maybe like the next phase, like this, the group that is slightly bigger, but very fundamental for this movement?
Exactly. And I was on this train so long before COVID, and I knew that this was a growing segment. I was passionate about it, but to your point, early adopters. I think COVID really exposed a lot of what was going on in the food system and gave people a chance to educate themselves a little bit more about that supply chain. So I really now think you're seeing the demand not only from online subscription for food. That category has gone through the roof. I look at then things like what Whole Foods is doing, and I really champion the way that they're thinking about regenerative shelf placement, because they're taking real data, turn reports, spends, turn reports, and they're making planograms in a regenerative sense and telling their suppliers. And we have a large LP that's a big supplier to Whole Foods that just showed us their supplier deck or presentation for 2022. And they're making room for up to 30% of their shelf space for regenerative products.
Wow. But like certified, or it's going to be them checking the outcomes? Like, what do they mean by regenerative products?
Oh, now this. So they would say justify a regenerative claim.
Okay.
Is how they would talk about it. So we can go down the certification path, which I think with our partnership with Rodale and the deep reverence with what the Institute does, we really like the ROC. That's the Regenerative Organic Certification that Dr. Bronner's and Patagonia and Rodale have put together, and where, we found white leaf. So again, one of our, kind of proprietary deal origination sources is the Rodale Institute. Mm-hmm. And so, I think that certification is a very high bar, but I will tell you that I end on the path of supporting the Dan Kittredge of the world and trying to say, let's figure out an outcomes-based result. Because as much as I appreciate the methodologies and the certification that get me a Demeter certification, it doesn't necessarily one-to-one correlate to what is in this apple that I'm about to eat. Mm-hmm. And so we really would like to know from a phytonutrient active compound, what's actually in that apple. And, Dan and his team, Holly, and there's a whole host of people working towards that transparency on the molecular nutrition side. And I think that's the panacea that we're all so excited about. But until then, I think we need to be better than organic, but organic's a great start. And I think the regenerative organic certification is a good way there.
So what are the deals? I mean, you mentioned white leaf, which we discussed previously as well, and I will link the interview we did with them below. What are the deals? Can you talk about, obviously, if there's something you can talk about that has happened over the summer, either specifically or very vaguely, something we didn't hear from Mark yet that you might be able to point us to what you're excited about? I mean, you mentioned other regenerative or beyond organic CPG brands, so we can imagine there might be other things we can buy in a supermarket. Okay. I imagine you don't want to mention any names, but anything else you can mention in terms of deals you have done so far, or should we check in like end of year for that or early next year?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give you sort of the categories of which we've done, because I think waste mitigation is huge.
Okay.
And so we really have that as a theme, and we're looking at a few things in that vertical.
Like waste on the farm, waste between farm and consumer, waste in the kitchen, what waste?
Really supply chain waste. So it's really, that most of the waste, and you heard Mark talk about this a little bit in his podcast, is really in that supply chain. And so there are simple technical solutions to reduce that waste that we want to invest in. So that's a big category we're excited about.
Organic waste, or like in the organic, because that's always then the question, okay, you're helping food waste be reduced fundamentally in a conventional extractive system, or are you focusing then on the organic part of the system, or even the regenerative, which is a much smaller part, obviously, of the value chain, or anything food waste is a huge issue. Let's invest and let's get it fixed.
I think you'll see the way we think about this is all these things is on a spectrum. And so, whether it's black soldier fly and reducing CAFO waste, whether it is supply chain transparency and just reduction of time, which time kills food. All of these across these two on farm, as Mark would tell you about biomass and all aspects, I would say, of waste. We're thinking about how we can move the needle with our capital.
So waste is definitely something we're going to hear announcement about. And anything else?
It is. And I would say two other very exciting categories for me are obviously the biological, let's call them amendments. I think there is a host of really exciting things that we're looking at. And we've got two very exciting announcements that are coming up in that particular space.
How do you screen them? Because I find, obviously you go way deeper than we do for inviting somebody on the podcast. And I find it very difficult to separate the noise from the interesting space in the amendments or inputs, because there's a lot happening, for sure, a lot of interesting things. I just am not a soil biologist and not a farmer at any large scale, except for some plants here and there. Like, how do you understand which ones are actually helping, let's say, a transition towards a more regenerative system, except not just getting the farmer to replace one input for another one and getting them hooked for that basically forever, which is a more sustainable, better input. I believe all of that, but it doesn't get you off the drug afterwards in terms of any transition. Like, how do you put them on the spectrum of, this is super interesting from a regenerative perspective, or this is just helping an extractive system to become just a bit cleaner?
Great question. So when we think about it in sort of a vector or directional sense. And so, what we would tell you is that in the perfect polyculture, animal integrated, biodiverse plot, the plants really take care of their own immunology. You really don't need all of the synthetic inputs and even the organic or biological inputs that we're talking about if you have the perfect homeostasis with the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the diversity, the perennialization that we talk about. So that's the aspirational endpoint. But I think to get there, we've got to prime the pump. And so coming from this large extractive, chemical-based agricultural system, we believe that there are some off-ramps. And we think of these amendments as off-ramps to get to the perfect spot.
And that's when you get interested, yeah.
And that's when we get interested. But really, to answer your question, I'm not a biologist. I'm not a chemist. I'm a philosopher and a businessman and an investor. And so, what we did is partner with the most respected minds and the best advisory staff that we could put together that would help us de-risk the tech on a tech side. So, we've got guys like Seth Levine that can help us think through, one of the best tech investors in the world, what a SaaS roadmap needs to look like for a given technology. We then have, the Rodale Institute with Jeff Moyer and his incredible staff of scientists, which we run all of our scientific ideas to ground with. We have Dr. Doug Cameron, who is the ex-Cargill chief scientist who had a regen apostasy and who is an incredibly valuable team member. I can't say enough.
Tell me more about that. What happened with that? Cargill isn't known to be the most regenerative company in the planet.
And wasn't certainly when he was there in the 90s, right? And so he just, as a thinker, as an outdoorsman, he thought there was more, and he went to go seek out a more holistic idea of what food and ag can be.
And left Cargill. Yeah.
Left Cargill and has done an amazing amount of things since. And really, we're honored to have him as one of our scientific leads. And then we have the Mad Ag crew. So, Dr. Phil Taylor is an advisor. So everything we look at, whether it's dandelions for rubber or whether it's some kind of a metabologenomic input that we're going to put in the farm, we run it through, our scientific advisory so that we can feel good about the probability of that science.
And so that's the second pillar, let's say, or the second stream of few potential announcements, let's say, by the end of this year. And then you mentioned the third. What's the third?
That's really the metabologenomics piece. So
what is that in plain English?
So for me, this is one of the most exciting things within the food and ag system, mainly because we know so little. I was thinking about your podcast with Dan Barber, and we just know so little about the food. We know 80% of the compounds in the given food are unknown to us, right? And so as we start thinking about aeroponics and hydroponics and cell-based things, I think the answer to all of that is it good or is it bad? I don't have an ethical position on any of it. What I think is the outcome is it comparable from a nutrient density standpoint for people? And we don't know that, but we're going to know that in the next, 5 to 7 years, with the likes of the Bright Seeds of the world and all of this investigation, to the molecular level, obviously what the Bionutrient Institute and Dan Kittredge are doing. So that next frontier for us is incredibly exciting. And basically, metabogenomics are crop protection derived from signaling molecules in the soil biome. Mm-hmm. And there is a vast amount of work that can be done there.
Of molecules.
Of molecules and of compounds, of which we just need massive amounts of discovery. And so we're partnered with some academic institutions.
And so what would it do? Would that be how to trigger some of these to repel certain pests or weeds? Or what would it do, let's say, for a farmer that isn't at that perfect state of a polyculture with integrated animals, et cetera, et cetera? Like, I'm a farmer and I want to go off the off-ramp, and this is a potential exit.
Exactly.
What would that look like for me? Would it be something I spray, something I inject, something I give to the animals that I might have running on my cover crops, or something? What would it actionable look like as a farmer for the soil?
Great point. So actionably for the farmer, it will be, a cost reduction of the input with the same outcomes of orders of magnitude, 5x cost reductions. And then the application can be seed inoculants. It can be drip irrigated. It can be sprayed. Broadly sprayed. So there's a multitude of ways of getting it to the crops and then into the animals, into their water supply or on the grasses for the rotational grazing set. So it's very cost effective and using basically the same hardware or infrastructure that you're using now. So it's very compatible for the steward.
And how is it then fundamentally different from, let's say, the soil amendment space you mentioned before? Why do you put it in a separate category? Is it like because the process is so fundamentally different, what it does, how it attacks the problem of I have pests and I have weeds? Or why does it deserve a separate category for you?
Because this is an entirely new scientific endeavor into small molecules, which are very different than their large molecule brethren. And it's a space of which we have very, very little understanding. And so I think, we know a lot about the chemical lens of what the biological input should look like. We know a little bit about the biological lens of what those can look like. And, I think about John Kemp and folks like that who I think are doing such great work on, the biological side. But there's a whole new frontier that these scientists and these institutes are learning, can really help with a variety of self-regulation that are all naturally occurring. So it's a really exciting field.
And is there a danger there, because we understand so little about the molecules in general and the molecules in the soil in particular, is there a danger we start playing with fire? Like what's the or it simply doesn't, maybe the danger is it doesn't work, which is okay. But is there a danger of what's the potential for side effects, for weird waking up a super weed that was there sleeping and we didn't know it was there? And like, what's the tricky part here?
Yeah, the tricky part is, and you nailed it. And I think about it in this old Greek adage from my philosophy, choros, ubris, ate. Okay. You have a great victory. From that comes incredible hubris, to which comes ultimate demise. And so, I think about the power of what we're playing with, and we talk about this a lot. We want to be supporting nature. We want to be listening and supporting the natural processes, not trying to over-engineer, right? We've seen what that hubris has done. If you look at what we created with the fertilizer early on, we had a great victory. But then we believed that we could do better. And we're really students of nature. The biomimicry is where we reside, and that's our sort of true north. And so as we think about any of these things, we have a very nuanced take to really support the natural processes, not to override or over-engineer, because we're thinking in short-term cycles and nature's thinking in millennia.
Yeah, I'm very curious about unpacking that further when there are concrete examples to discuss. So let's park that for now.
I'm excited about that.
Let's switch gears a bit with, you mentioned before we have to prime the pump. So that's where we're moving back to the financial side of things. Let's say the pump has been primed. So you are actually in charge of a $1 billion investment fund or 10 billion or like a significant large amount. I ask this question because I'm curious about what people would focus on, not because I want to know the exact breakdown of I would put 150 to 50 into this. I'm curious, what would you focus on if you had basically, I wouldn't say unlimited, but almost unlimited resources in terms of financial to invest? Obviously, to invest, the grant part of things, you can do it with the returns if you want to, but I'm interested as an investor, what would you focus on if you had a considerable investment fund? and the pump is being primed. Or maybe there's not enough deal flow. Could also be like, I would put it in priming the pump further because the money is not the issue, but the deal flow is. So what would be your take on that?
And I think I would say to you, first, we believe that we're going to build, a series of funds and hopefully be deploying billions of dollars into this space, across multiple asset classes, infrastructure, ag tech, all the things that we care deeply about, farmland, agroforestry. But I think if you ask me what I would do with $1 billion, because, it's a huge amount of money, don't get me wrong. But when you think about the investing landscape, and I think about, aquaculture, which I don't think you can leave out of the regenerative equation because the interconnectivity of our planet is such that, it's deeply involved.
Oceans and forests are connected.
Oceans and forests are connected. That's a $100 trillion opportunity. So when you ask me about $1 billion, it begins to pale in comparison. So my answer, I guess, first would be, I would do exactly what we're doing, because we came to this thesis and understanding because we have to build the first set of companies, to build this asset class. It's still nascent and has, 10 years of growth to get to its sort of complementary asset classes.
Do you see it as a separate asset class or a lens that you can, like the regeneration lens or something you can put over potentially all asset classes, looking at infrastructure, looking at farmland, looking at even mobility potentially, looking at housing, looking at education, or would it be all bundled into, okay, this is the regenerative asset class? What do you see there?
I think you articulated it well, Koen. I think it's more of, it's a well-articulated thesis that moves as an umbrella across all asset classes.
Yeah, because now you're applying it to VC, but in X years when this fund is invested, you'll be applying it hopefully to XYZ, and then you'll be applying it to, with obviously different parameters, because it's different than you invest in farmland, but probably different amounts as well. So I got triggered because it's a bit the same saying impact investing is an asset class. Now you're applying a lens to all your investments and potentially your philanthropy and also your life. How can I minimize negative impact and how can I net positive as much as possible? And that's a trigger part because when the impact investing space was born, it was an asset class, or it was mentioned like these people in the corner. Let's keep them there. Let's grow that a bit. And then that's okay. No, it needs to be applied to everything, also to education.
Well, and for me, it's like ESG and the nomenclature in investing. I mean, to choose ESG feels a little bit contrived. I mean, everything should be looked at through an environmental, social lens, in my opinion. And it is looked at as just very negative in most cases. Like everything is impact investing. It's just very often very negative. Like the impact is negative, if you like it or not. It's just, you cannot really escape that. Like everything is on a regenerative spectrum, probably on the darker side, the degenerative side, but it is on the spectrum. Any farm is. Well, and that's why, Koen, we're working with, the Iroquois valleys of the world, because I think that there's a lot of complementarity with our Fund One portfolio, how they think about stewarding the land, but don't really have all of the sort of subcomponents dialed in. And
how are you working with them? How does that look like in practice?
Well, so we're in talks right now, but we're, really wanting to put fence collars on, as you can imagine, a lot of the Iroquois Valley lands because of so many reasons, as you well know.
Because it makes sense. Yeah.
Because it makes sense. And because we then think there's an income stream associated with that from the carbon markets, which then makes financial sense on top of the environmental sense.
Of course, there's your portfolio companies, especially the more ag tech focused ones, need a lot of farmers to work with. And if you are working with a lot of farmers that have taken the off ramp already and are on an interesting transition, it becomes very interesting. Yeah.
Well, and I think about, How Good, which obviously we're huge proponents of How Good, and How Good is able to use those data points, new acreage or hectares with rotational grazing, to put into their lattice matrix so they can understand a larger idea of regenerative sourcing to all of their database and clients.
So it makes a lot of sense to start a farmland fund at some point. And they're very curious how you would structure that. But so with the 1 billion, you would do pretty much the same as you've been doing. But let's take that away and give you one wish, you have a magic wand and you can change one thing in the food and ag sector. What would that be? Could be anything from transparency to soil probes everywhere to data being accessible to all farmland being managed in the commons, like anything you can imagine, what would that one wish be?
So three things immediately popped to my mind. One is it's not just about carbon, it's about water.
Okay. Coming back to what we started. Yeah.
Water. Water is the key fundament for all of this. Without it, none of it happens. And so, we focus on carbon a lot, our water resources through the acid rain, through the pH increase in our streams, through what we're doing to the oceans. It's critical, but it's kind of, off in a corner. So I want to wake up the world about that. I think, I don't know if you've read the Dan or Paul Greenberg book, The Omega Principle. I think it's a great one to think about that. And then Patagonia has a documentary out, Artificial, which is a good one to watch also. I think my second one, and we talked about it a little bit, is provenance, is the transparency in our food system. And that's understanding, unfortunately, the plastic particulate matter, the heavy metals. It's everything. And it's then the good stuff, the active compounds, the phytonutrients, the minerals, the good stuff. We just know so little. And so I'm really excited about the epiphanies that are happening in the food space, which I think are really going to validate premium pricing, a variety of things that really make this flywheel work.
And then the third, and then I'm going to make you choose because I said one.
And then the third is, we've talked about it a little bit, is the long duration patient thinking. So it's the myth of liquidity.
What is the myth of liquidity?
There's sort of a historical precedent in financial management that is what I would say is over conservative to the liquidity side of the scale.
I always want to get out, be able to get out. Yeah.
Being able to get out quickly or have it available at any time, which is really a disservice to the investor over a long duration, because patient capital, if you ask Jeremy Grantham, patient capital and venture capital is the greatest returning asset class of all times. And so, I really think people can do better by thinking about really what their real liquidity needs are. It's a real analytic process to get there, but then being able to go long with the rest of those assets. That's a big piece of it. The other side of that coin is every investment you make and every dollar you spend, there's an ethic attached to that. How conscientious are we every time we're spending the dollar, whether it's on the food, at a restaurant, on a piece of clothing? How much do you think about the entire supply line, right? The dignity of the wages of the people in the supply line, the diversity and inclusion, that we don't think about this sort of conscious capitalism as much as we should. And I think it's really important for people to understand where they put their dollars.
And now you have to choose one thing. What would be the key? I'm thinking it's going to be water, but tell me, what would you choose?
I think it's, I said it's the alpha and the omega, but I really think for me, for what we're doing in regenerative, for the expeditious need to get the soils, to get the methodologies on a grand scale, I think solving the nutrient transparency and understanding the differentiation in our food supply is imperative.
Okay, so you go for understand. And this is a question that definitely inspired by John Kemp. What do you believe to be true? We heard a few things, but where are you contrarian? Like, what do you believe to be true about the regen ag space or regen ag and food space, or even the regeneration space, if you want to make it a bit wider, that others don't? Like, where do you, when you were having a drink after the Oakland conference a few weeks ago and you were discussing something and suddenly somebody said, but you really believe like that? Where are you contrarian in your beliefs within this movement that often thinks very similar, or at least it seems to be on the outset, which is a bit disturbing sometimes?
Well, I'm going to go back to the water thing because everybody thinks terrestrially in regards to regenerative food and ag, right? And so when I hear and what I understand is going on is a real proxy for what we've done on the land, right? So, we talk about proteins a lot and think about them a lot and invest in them a lot. And we can have another conversation about that at some point. But it's very important that along that spectrum, we consider fish, which is the most efficient protein in the entire channel. And as we think about aspirationally, Koen, how do you acquire your beef if you're a meat eater? We would say ideally you're bow hunting your own pronghorn. Okay. But that's sort of anachronistic and it's not really realistic anymore. And Okay, so then downline, what's better? And we end all the way over here at the worst sort of animal husbandry CAFO operations, and there's a lot in between. The same exact thing is happening now to our oceans. My kids aren't going to be able to go line catch wild salmon in Bristol Bay. It's not going to be available anymore. So we're moving all of our aquaculture to land, and we're creating fish CAFOs, FAFOs. It's the exact same thing that we did on the land. And so, I think what people aren't thinking about, or where I'm a little bit contrarian, is we have to focus on this too. And I think there's a time right now where there's tons of capital being spent on aquaculture facilities, which are, again, monoculture, overstocked facilities where sometimes they're even creating genetics so that you have, a color, a size, just like we did in chicken and beef. So I really think there's an interesting time right now for the regenerative community to focus on how can we move the needle away from sort of those CAFOs for fishing and think about rewilding and hybridizing the estuaries, where we have the ability to both assist nature, but not over-engineer, and then rebuild what, she had originally made as our fisheries of the world. I think that's my position.
Yeah, we're small teaser. Nothing is finalized yet, but we're thinking about a series on regen aquaculture, as it's been, I think we talked about it 2 or 3 times, and that's it, which is a shame for 70% of the Earth's surface actually should be called water surface. And I have a history in sustainable aquaculture, and I'm very passionate to come back to the immense opportunities there, and not the complete lack, but big lack of the regen space to look at it, but also the rest of the food and egg space. It's sort of this forgotten gigantic corner, which is most of the room actually, but we're sort of not looking at it because we're so focused inwards on the land piece at the moment, which, don't get me wrong, needs a lot of work.
Needs a lot of work. But just a final point, just like we, grow all this corn and we zap all these resources of our terrestrial, for ethanol, for high fructose corn syrup, and for animal food, we're basically mining the oceans for the same thing. We're mining all of the oceans for fish meal. Fish meal,
fish oil. And then, and the potential there is enormous because of size, but it's also enormous because of the regeneration capacity. If you look at some fisheries that were closed off, or even hopefully with some transition finance for the fishermen and women, but unfortunately mostly men, the rebound of these systems has been very well documented and is astonishing compared to land masses. Exactly. I mean, you have to go to the tropics to see that kind of growth that fast and that kind of life coming back if you just let it and assist it and manage that transition. So there's a space there that is pretty untapped, and we're looking forward to getting deeper into that. So thank you for that nudge in that direction. And to ask a final question, what would you, without advising, what would you investors that are listening to this, it might be a room full of investors, smart impact investors, obviously, all looking for the deepest net positive. Would you push them toward or nudge them towards aquaculture? Would you nudge them towards other forgotten or not sometimes overlooked sectors? What would you tell them if they want to get active? Should they buy a farm? Should they get their hands dirty? Should they buy a supermarket like you did? What's the best off-ramp from the extractive investment world into the regenerative one?
Look, I think anybody who will be a land steward and take it upon themselves to rehabilitate or sustain a piece of land in the right way, I think that personally and societally is a great thing. I would like less corporate ownership of the land and more individualized, democratized land holdings. I think that benefits.
I'm already curious how you're going to set up a farmland fund, but that we keep that for our next one. Yeah.
So yes, but I would say then from an investing standpoint, I really think, and we talk to a lot of institutions like this, I think indexing across regen venture with a fund like Trailhead, there's others out there that I respect deeply. I think that's the way that you get exposure to a broad base of these assets, and you de-risk them by, that diversity, quantity, and portfolio construction. I think if you're a direct investor, I would say, make sure that you're taking all of your philanthropic dollars, maybe it's your Roth, maybe it's your IRA, maybe it's your DAF, and making sure those are directed.
Which are all very much US terms, just for the rest of the world. Yeah.
US financial terms. Yes.
If you don't know what they mean, you're probably not in the US.
But make sure it goes back to my conscious spending and investment. Think about it. The biggest thing I would implore investors to do is be more conscious about the power of their investment and where they're putting those dollars. It really is the catalyst for change.
And I always say final question, and then it never happens. To round off this conversation in terms of Trailhead, you're hoping to finalize a number of investments over the next weeks. In terms of fundraising, what can you share there? We're now talking the middle of October. Obviously, this is going on full speed at the moment. What's your target and when, more or less, in terms of closing the fund and investing that amount? Or will it be a slightly longer ongoing process? What's the current on that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I think we'll have, 12 to 15 investments by the end of the year. Final close for the fund will be at year end. And we're really excited about the LPs that have been supporting us, who have also really said that they're going to be in our next fund. And so, we think we've got our fund one set that will then be sort of our fund two anchors. And, we're just really grateful for the support of our LP base and their open-minded mission thinking. And so we are closing in on our final close for the fund. And so, would welcome conversations of interested parties, but look forward to really moving on.
Which will be around what kind of number? So
50 million, sorry.
50.
50 is the closing target for the end. And we're really probably, irrespective of hitting that exact number, going to close the fund at year end so we can continue to deploy another 12 to 15 in 2022.
Okay.
Which will be the majority of the portfolio.
Okay, super. And looking forward to check in on that and see how it goes. And good luck, because there can be extremely stressful months I've seen from the inside, and I can imagine at this period, both on the fundraising and the investing side, to get this over the line by year end, which is always a crazy period. So I wish you a lot of luck with that.
Well, thank you, Koen. It's really a pleasure to wake up every day with my partners and do this, to feel like we're doing the right work, and just excited to be, with thought leaders like you in this space. It's a great time to be in this space.
Thank you so much for that. If you found the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast valuable, there are a few simple ways you can use to support it. Number 1, rate and review the podcast on your podcast app. That's the best way for other listeners to find the podcast, and it only takes a few seconds. Number 2, share this podcast on social media or email it to your friends and colleagues. Number 3, if this podcast has been of value to you, and if you have the means, please join my membership community to help grow this platform and allow me to take it further. You can find all the details on gumroad.com/investingregenag or in the description below. Thank you so much, and see you at the next podcast. Dear friends of the podcast, I'm super excited to share with you the online video course Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food. How to put money to work in regenerating soils at scale and growing a lot of tasty food while doing it. Why are we doing this course? After 100 interviews and more than 100 hours of audio asking the question how to put money to work in regenerating soils, and have been following the space since 2011 and recording these podcasts since 2016, we thought it was time to share our lessons learned. What have we seen in the space over the last years? How have we built our decision-making framework? What to focus on with the podcast? How have we picked interviewees? And what questions should you ask? What is happening in the space? What should you read? What should you listen? What should you watch? How to approach this space. For whom is this course? You, the soil builders and investors in this space. The soil builders, people working in this space, entrepreneurial farmers, fund managers, vehicle builders, crowd investing, platform builders, agtech companies, farm-to-gut food companies, permaculture, keyline designers, holistic management consultants, etc., etc. People that are building soil at scale. And the investors who are putting their own money to work through their family office or as private individuals, or people who are putting other people's money to work through foundations, institutional capital, banks, insurance companies, etc. Is this course free? No. This is pay what you think it's worth. Meaning, I have no way of knowing what this course will be worth to you. And I'm very aware that among the listeners of this podcast, we have people with very different means. So I'm inviting you, if this course is creating value to you, and if you have the means, to consider paying what you think it's worth. Thank you. So what is this course? It's currently a series of 17 videos, mostly ranging from 10 to 15 minutes, plus PDF slides, so you don't have to ride along. We're gonna look into why invest in regenerative agriculture and why extractive agriculture is so risky, how to invest, what kind of frameworks you could and I think should build, what to invest in, what kind of co-investors you could find, or what kind of investors you could find if you're a soil builder. Every lesson will have a digging deeper part where I will share what kind of reports, what kind of interviews, what kind of videos you can look into if you want to dig deeper. We're going to look at nutrient density, landscape design, and a lot more. So what is it not? It's not a list of investable deals. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in this world. We're really at the beginning of the regenerative agriculture and food revolution. It's also not investment advice. Before making any investment, please find professional investment advice. So get ready, get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or whatever you're drinking. Click on the link below, sign up, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback.